that be able to pull up onto the screen so they can see general fund?
Make sure it's going into the right. Yeah, we're supposed to now. It says it's going into the Pearl, but we want it to go through the DI, right? It's not Chief Small, sir. It's on our end. Can you hear me talking? It is. Okay, I can't hear y'all though, so we got the IT guys going to fix it. Are we wanting it? Yeah, we want it on the speaker so everyone can hear us. Hey, go ahead and talk to you.
This is headquarters train up, audio visual check.
Here now.
Sorry. We're having IT problems.
Is it okay to go ahead and put them on the screen?
Yeah.
This is headquarters train up. 10, 9, 8, 7. This is headquarters straight up. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Why don't you speak right now?
Hello.
Did you hear that? Test 1, 1, 2. 1, 2, test. You heard that? Test 1, 1, 2. Go, go, go.
Test 1, 2, 3.
So anybody that's right here, keep talking. Should be able to hear.
Test 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay.
They can hear that?
You can hear us? Okay. Then I'll turn it over to. Yeah, most of the microphone is right. It's Ricardo. Y'all are good?
Okay, great. Chris, we're good to go.
We're just going to stay in our seats and
Well,
talk.
maybe we do that because otherwise, general fund's right there.
Yeah, yeah. Can you remind me which order you want people to go in?
I put it in order here.
Okay. Okay, so that's good.
Yeah. And so just like after each person speaks, then just
Do you want me to introduce the next person? Or do you
no,
want to
introduce everyone and then just cue the next person.
You ready to go?
Yeah.
All right.
You too.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel on a new American way of training. This panel will discuss the challenges posed by China and Russia and the opportunities presented by new technologies that we really think could open up a paradigm shift in military training. This discussion and this panel are part of a year-long study at the Center for a New American Security, or CNAS, which is examining what we are calling a new American way of training. I'm Chris Doherty. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security, and I'll be your moderator today. Prior to joining CNAS, as it's called at DC, I worked for 4 years at the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where I worked on strategy and force development. And for those of you who've read the 2018 National Defense Strategy, I hope you enjoyed it. It's one of my very proudest moments in my career. And I'm really lucky to be joined by this panel. We were actually just having a musical discussion, and I had a little musical joke, which is that I feel like I'm in that Talking Head song, How Did I Get Here? Because I'm on this panel full of people who are like incredibly brilliant, and I'm just kind of like the sore thumb with the weird long hair, which I gotta address that. But anyway, I'm really lucky to be joined by all these folks today. So first, I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague, Jennifer McCardle, who's an adjunct senior fellow at CNAS, as well as a product strategist at Improbable. Jenny is one of the foremost thinkers and practitioners at the intersection of strategy, military training, and technology, and I really, truly mean that. She has written extensively on how the Department of Defense can better leverage live, virtual, and constructive training to improve the readiness of the joint force. Second, I'd like to introduce retired Admiral John Richardson. Admiral Richardson had a distinguished career as a submariner, including command of the USS Honolulu, the Submarine Development Squadron, Submarine Group 8, and the U.S. Navy Submarine Force. He also served in the Joint Staff Operations Directorate as the Director of Strategy and Policy at Joint Forces Command, and he finished his career, as many of you probably know, serving as the 31st Chief of Naval Operations from 2015 to 2019. Today, he serves on the CNAS Board of Directors. Next, I'd like to welcome retired Air Force General Mike Holmes. General Holmes was a fighter pilot with 500 combat flight hours, I first met him in the Pentagon when he was the Air Force's Deputy Chief of Staff for Strategic Plans and Programs, where he essentially oversaw the entire Air Force portion of the DoD budget. From there, he took over command of the Air Combat Command, an organization that operates over 1,000 aircraft worldwide, and today he serves as an adjunct senior fellow at CNAS. Now I'd like to introduce, joining us virtually, Army General Paul Funk. He is currently the 17th Commander of U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, and as TRADOC Commander, he is responsible for, for 32 Army schools organized under 10 centers of excellence that recruit, train, and educate more than 750,000 soldiers and service members annually. He has commanded at every level, and I did actually check this from company to Corps Command, and has deployed 6 times from Operations Desert Shield and Storm all the way through Operation Inherent Resolve. And then finally, obviously last but not least, I'd like to introduce Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Kimberly Jackson. She is serving as the DASD for Force Readiness in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness. Prior to joining the administration, she worked for many years as a researcher at the RAND Corporation, where she worked on a variety of topics, including leader development, professional military education, and talent management. In addition to her research background, she also has served in the U.S. Naval Reserve. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm so excited for this panel. This should be an outstanding discussion. And with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Jennifer McArdle.
Thanks, Chris. Can you hear me? All right, brilliant. So towards the end of the Cold War, technological changes, the shift to an all-volunteer force, and the painful experience in Vietnam prompted a series of paradigm shifts in the U.S. military's approach to training. Training innovations like the Navy's Top Gun School, the Air Force's Red Flag exercise, and the Army's creation of the MILES program and the National Training Center introduced a new level of rigor in training. Each change helped to build the Joint Forces' tactical and operational superiority, which was visibly on display during the Persian Gulf Wars. So today, the Department of Defense requires a similar rethink in the way it trains its force. As my colleague Chris Doherty has noted, the military capabilities and strategies of strategic competitors like China and Russia have undermined the current American way of war, in a way of war that's built on power projection, all-domain dominance, and the ability to operate from sanctuaries. So as Chris has argued that these threats and emerging technologies like artificial intelligence require rethinking how the U.S. Army fights towards a new American way of war. I'd argue that we not only have to rethink the way the military fights, but also how it trains. But that first requires us to identify what are the problems that our training efforts that are currently facing. And so to provide a framework for this discussion today, I'd posit that there are 6 issues that can act as starting points for training reform. So the first is training for degradation dominance. All right. Oh my gosh. Okay. At work or in our personal lives, we've all experienced the dislocation. All right. This is Tech Issues 101, which I'm about to talk about. So at work or in our personal lives, we've all experienced it.
Unwind it there a little bit.
All right. How's this? No? I feel like I should just project. So at work or in our personal lives, we've all experienced the dislocation and frustration that happens when computer networks or other critical systems, like this, don't work as expected. So in a future crisis or conflict with China or Russia, this sort of degradation or disruption will be the norm rather than the exception. So instead of trying to ensure that nothing breaks, our goal should be to sustain military operations in spite of a degraded or denied environment. So this requires a paradigm shift from information dominance to degradation dominance. So we need regular training events that realistically simulate cyber, space, and electromagnetic disruption. For instance, synthetic training can enable us to move beyond white cards and inject a higher level of fidelity into training events, particularly when it comes to simulating the disruption or manipulation of information. Exercises must simulate attacks on command, control, and communications to force units to adopt mission command. Subordinate leaders must make decisions without being able to communicate with higher headquarters and demonstrate that they understand the commander's intent and that they can operate creatively and with initiative within it. So the second is training for a lack of sanctuaries. So in the event of a conflict, China and Russia will target our forward operating bases and our homeland with precision, whether they're using long-range missiles or cyber attacks. So training events need to simulate heavy air, missile, and ground attacks, allowing units to practice resilience measures and maintain operations under realistic conditions. We also need greater cross-training across our force. Operations against China or Russia will result in far greater attrition rates than past conflicts, so we need personnel in units accustomed to carrying out a range of functions beyond their assigned tasks to include maintenance and security. And we see this today with the Air Force's multi-capable airman program. We also need to increase individual and unit level training in camouflage, concealment, and deception to fool adversary targeting and increase the resilience of our forces and bases. Again, this is somewhere where synthetic environments would be particularly powerful. Allowing us to train for coordinated deception activities that require electronic, cyber, or even social media ranges. So the third is training for contested logistics. So China and Russia will seek to target and sabotage key logistics nodes or impose virtual attrition on our force, ensuring that we're unable to complete our missions, either because they're delayed getting to theater, lacking in support or material, diverted to other missions, or they're suppressed by the threat of attack. So the DoD has updated aspects of war games, exercises, and mobility training to prepare for contested environments. But more emphasis should be placed on contested logistics. And such an emphasis shouldn't be limited solely to our services, but also critical civilian and commercial support capabilities, like the contract mariners that are charged with our surge sea lift fleet. So the fourth is training for protraction. So the Pentagon's begun to think very deeply about how we may prevail in the opening stages of a conflict against Russia or China. But wars between great power competitors, they rarely end after the first battle. So the DoD must prepare for a grinding, multi-theater conflict that could drag on for months or even years. So this requires us to inculcate a certain mindset in the joint force, one of resilience and endurance, but also of adaptability. So history demonstrates the importance of learning and adaptability during war, which can be partially instilled through a culture of learning and decentralized training within the joint force. And this is much like what the Germans did prior to and throughout World War I. And the outcome of great power war may also be determined by those that can up-ramp the production of munitions, who can quickly replace lost platforms, and who has a more adaptive and resilient industrial base. So this is also going to require new and creative ideas, something that we can instill in our leaders and future leaders through training and experiential war games. The fifth is training for a lack of all domain dominance. So in a conflict with China or Russia, our success will hinge on our ability to quickly identify, target, and attack our adversary centers of gravity. So unlike the Gulf War, this cannot wait for us to achieve domain superiority or dominance. The need for speed requires new concepts that exploit Chinese and Russian weaknesses prior to battle, and many of these concepts will likely leverage autonomy and artificial intelligence in the form of human-machine teams. And again, this is an area where synthetic environments may also be particularly powerful, as they provide a place for us to simultaneously train autonomous systems and AI and develop warfighter trust in these systems. And then, of course, we need to develop leaders that possess, as the French would say, a certain coup d'oeil, the ability to quickly identify and exploit possibilities and strike adversary operational centers of gravity as the conflict unfolds. And this is something that wargaming is uniquely suited to provide. So the sixth and final one is training across all instruments of national power. So China and Russia, they're going to use a variety of methods to influence regional states to advance their own geostrategic ends, and whether this is information, political, psychological, or economic coercion. So rather than unilateral military responses, These challenges demand better use of all instruments of US national powers in tandem with partners and allies. So this requires a different approach to wargaming. We need to increase the frequency of interagency and intergovernmental experiential learning, allowing these groups to build deeper connections, but also develop more creative approaches on how these various instruments of power can work together. And throughout all 6 of these issues, we must grapple with fundamental questions tied to individual and collective training outcomes and different learning techniques. So advances in the science of learning, big data, and psychology, among many other disciplines, have allowed us to be far more detailed, rigorous, and objective in how we assess learning outcomes and how we can better target training and education to meet individual needs, and potentially better assess collective training efficacy. So these advances allow us to rethink and reassess training content, architectures, pedagogy, and content delivery. And as we capture far more objective data about training outcomes through various devices, ranges, and synthetic environments, the opportunity to rethink and reassess readiness in a far objective way, measuring outputs rather than inputs, becomes possible. So to tie this all up, I want to go back to where I started. So shortly after the Gulf War, the Senate Armed Services Committee asked Major General McCaffrey, then the commander of the 24th Infantry Division, how the war was only won in 100 hours. McCaffrey responded that the war did not take 100 hours to win. It took 15 years. His response was really indicative of a generation of leaders that saw the military fracture in Vietnam, and they spent the rest of their adult life engaging in this profound and remarkable period of organizational reform within the military. And that included, as we all know, really amazing innovations in training. And so I just love this anecdote because the way we think about training, it's not going to change overnight. But we at CNAS believe that the conversations like the one we're having today, the really amazing innovative potential that you see on the show floor here at ITSEC, and the great work that our services and OSD are doing, as my fellow panelists are going to highlight today, that they're really steps in the right direction. So thanks.
Thanks, Jenny. I think that's a outstanding framework for what I think some of the other panelists are going to talk about today. And with that, I'd like to introduce Admiral Richardson.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thanks everybody for the chance to be here. It's good to be anywhere, nowadays. So thank the sponsors who have put ITSEC together, in particular the Center for New American Security. I've got to tell you, I found CNAS so useful as the Chief of Naval Operations. Their product is so practical and focused, and now very proud to be on the board of directors. And I really like them also because under the guidance of some very thoughtful and experienced leaders in government, they really dedicate themselves to training, sort of paying forward, right? Training the next generation of national security leaders. And so, Chris and Jenny, thanks so much for everything. I've got a fair amount of experience in training, a lot of it just being the slowest kid in class, and also providing training. As the Chief of Naval Operations, the guidance I put out included an entire line of effort on learning, which I think has taken hold and been a driving force inside the Navy in terms of just emphasizing the importance of training and learning. And as I think at my geekiest moments, I think of training existing in terms of kind of a space defined by 3 axes that define a volume, right? And you want to maximize the volume of this space. And I can see just from looking out at the audience that almost nobody is following that visual with me. So I'll switch and describe it in terms more of sort of 3 knobs, okay? That we can use to define and fine-tune a useful training environment to get a team or of whatever size, individual all the way up to major teams ready for a particular situation. And I think that in the last 20 years, the introduction of technology, particularly some of the technologies that you can see on the floor at the conference here, allow us to be much more representative of what an operator or a team might see in the real world. And whereas before, for much of our careers, in this room anyway, we could probably only take that knob to a 5, certainly now we can take that all the way to a 10 we can achieve levels of reality and fidelity that I think really, were the domain of Orson Scott Card and Ender's Game not too long ago, but are now achievable. So I'll talk about what these three knobs are. What are those axes? So the first one, I think, would describe the degree of fidelity. How realistic or prototypic is the material that the operator will see during a training exercise? And this is, again, where we've seen just big steps in our ability to simulate. And so, a lot of us are familiar with sort of the zero position of that knob, which is passive reading and PowerPoint and a lot of that. There's a role for that still, much more passive. I think at about the 5 level, many of us grew up with simulators that could simulate, to a certain degree of fidelity, get to the basics of individual and team training, but that was pretty light. At the 7.5 position, I think we're at sea, right, in the Navy context, with actual platforms, actual sensors, actual comms, et cetera, to get a taste of the fog and friction that just always is part of actually getting out and operating. But on the scenario side of that, just by virtue of the limitations of that, the scenarios were pretty light. Now, and I'd ask the Navy crowd here to keep me honest. If I'm behind or I'm wrong, just yell out "Crazy Ivan" or something like that, and I'll turn the mic over. But but through the combination of being at sea with simulation embedded in, sort of augmented reality, we're really seeing a much more high fidelity scenario. And so this live virtual constructive training gets not only at the fog and friction of just getting out and operating, the difficulties associated with that, including degradation and some of the things that Jenny highlighted, but also you can sort of really amp up the opposition, and you can really make the threat scenario much more complicated. That gets it up towards a 10. Okay, and there's these lessons, and the fidelity generally increases with these techniques, but also, so does the cost, right? And so we need to be very thoughtful about how we employ this. As I was training a lot at sea, at great expense, right? We would bring, multiple submarines, exercise weapons, a surface action group, special warfare, a whole, scenario would come. They would actually be there, and the whole thing might grind to a halt because, we had to stop and teach a particular person how to steer a torpedo, which is a lesson that should have happened way, way back, on the shore in the classroom or something. And then I think that even with all of that fidelity and all of that ability to augment and enhance reality, we still are in the infancy in some areas, and Jenny touched on a couple of them. I think that space, cyber, information warfare, and network warfare, we're limited not only by the technological ability to simulate these things, but as I'm sure everybody in this room is aware, it quickly goes to TSSCI, which quickly goes down, just next down to single digits of people and single digits numbers of places that you can do that type of training, and we've got to work our way through that. It was really interesting when I was the head of the submarine force. There was this conversation I had, which basically amounted to, here you are, it's the game is on, the entire submarine force is surging forward, and I was like, okay, this is what we do. Here's the playbook. They're like, no, Admiral. The actual playbook we're going to use is this one, right? And so we'll take this one that got you through the regular season, got you through the playoffs and all of that. Now that it's Super Bowl time, here's your playbook. It's all TSSCI, and oh, by the way, it's all trick plays. It's like, Statue of Liberties and flea flickers and all that stuff. It's like, well, we haven't seen any of this. Oh no, it's going to be good. It's going to be just fine. Don't worry about it. So we need to get through that. Okay. So that's the first knob, is fidelity. Second knob, I think, describes a number of players. Okay, and this one goes from individual training all the way up to unit training, squadron training, fleet training, and theater training. And I would emphasize the bigger numbers, I think, are particularly important as we start to get our minds around, the challenges of a China or a Russia as an opponent, right? This is not going to be, only squad warfare. And, our concentration on counterterrorism and the exquisite work that the special forces and everybody did at that level, breaking our minds out of that paradigm is something that we really need to exercise. And so this, team training for coordinated operations between team members, I think all the way up to full theater training and wargaming and the relationship between those two, a full team for a full game, even for a long, protracted battle or conflict, I think are things that we need to do. We can do this much more easily, and the Navy is doing a lot of these things, right? We can bring teams together physically if we want to and still need to, and there's, as you all know, there's some benefits to doing that, but we can also bring teams together virtually and connect them. We can connect sort of cockpit simulators together virtually, and you all know about that. And you can get more sets and reps by virtue of doing that, right? Just take the physical travel and all of that out of it, and you can get more repetitions, which I think is an important part of training. So second knob would be kind of the number of players or the scope of the theater, from individual up to global, really. Then the third knob, I think, would describe the difficulty of the actual training scenario. And we're all kind of familiar with this crawl, walk, run approach to doing business. It's pretty effective. I think that this level of difficulty is related to, but different from, the fidelity of the scenario. And I think that, some of the scenarios that Jenny described are some of those unique dimensions or unique challenges, unique scenarios that are going to confront us as we move forward in great power rivalry, great power warfare. And then, in terms of what are we really after what are the training objectives for the operator or the team, right? At the low end, sort of the zero, can they just comply, right? Can they get through the checklists and operate the gear safely within the physics envelope of the platform, or just do that? Then, as you ramp up in level of difficulty, you can start to get at the decisions that are being made. You can start to assess the teamwork that's being employed. That's a little bit more subjective. And then, at the highest end, what about the level of creativity that's being exercised, particularly by our commanders, from the very top theater level commanders all the way down to the small unit commanders, okay? We can train to the failure point, right, without paying the costs. And as Jenny mentioned, the scenarios are different, right? What defines difficulty now is different than what defined difficulty before. Degradation, lack of sanctuary, logistics, cyberspace. Also this idea of a long war, right? Both at the campaign level, but also just at the exercise level. We used to get a lot of insight by putting a team in a trainer and staying and keeping them there for a week, right? And so they would basically be at undersea combat for a week, and they would have bunks that they could go and sleep in for a little while, and they would come back, and you start to see things that manifest themselves as fatigue sets in, tension sets in, personalities, uncertainty, all the things that we would actually experience at sea. Now, with all this fidelity, and you walk around the floor, it's easy to think of this as sort of just another hyped up game. But of course, training is different than gaming in some super important ways. I would, if I could capture it in one word, it would be feedback, okay? A training scenario really incorporates feedback. Feedback to the operators for sure, right? That would be maybe the primary audience. But as we were discussing, as we walked around the floor, the feedback from a training scenario could also be very useful to system developers and designers. The feedback could be much more useful to training system developers and designers. And then, of course, even to those that are designing operational concepts and war plans, just this data is so useful, particularly from a rich scenario, that we should treat every bit of that data as a treasure, okay? Now, I described three knobs, but I'd actually say that, lately we would have to talk about a fourth knob, and that is artificial intelligence. And how to get after an assessment of the degree to which artificial intelligence is helping, enhancing the human intelligence that's at bear. And it's like Spinal Tap. You know, AI takes all of our knobs to 11, okay? And there's not many Spinal Tap crowds in here. Come on. I thought I'd get a little rise out of that one. Jeez. Is my mic working? Anyway, this means, you know, of course, artificial intelligence is going to be trained by data, and so we need a data strategy that's going to serve the development of those algorithms. And then, of course, how to judge the effectiveness of artificial intelligence is to make sure that it is delivering the capability that we wanted. It didn't get mistrained by some bad data. And I think that in some cases, something like the Turing test might work. Can AI do it as good as a human person? But, you know, while we've learned a lot about artificial intelligence, we've also learned a heck of a lot about human intelligence with its inherent biases, judgment errors that result in suboptimal decisions. And so rather than replicating a person, we really want to think about the teaming of those two, where you can use AI to mitigate some of these human vulnerabilities and enhance it rather than just try and recreate it. I'll close with saying to this audience that in all of these things, and Jenny touched on this, we're in a race and we're behind. We've enjoyed, for a long time, superiority in sensing, and particularly in space. And we use that to great advantage. You know, when you can really dominate the first O of the OODA loop, that gives you a tremendous step on your opponent. But that's all going away, right? Sensing is becoming absolutely ubiquitous. And we're vulnerable, you know, in many areas as it becomes much more available to everybody. I think that in a very short time, most, if not all, of our field training at sea is going to be observable. Certainly our physical maneuver will be observable to anybody who wants to see it. You can pull it down from the internet, right? Our electromagnetic maneuver will be observable. Our communications will be observable. And so everything will be, how do you prepare for Sunday's game if your opponent is sitting in the stands as you practice during the week, right? A lot of this is going to mean that we're going to have to do this virtually, okay? And so this means that we've got to validate models, that we've got to validate scenarios, we've got to start that effort so that we can come into places that are much harder to observe and get some legitimate training done. So the race is on. To the people within the sound of my voice, it's not a moment to lose, and I look forward to seeing everybody here rise to the challenge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Admiral. It was wonderful. You know, your comment about the Sunday's game gets me thinking we should ask the people who've played against Bill Belichick for the last 15 to 20 years how it feels when their playbook has been observed. Sorry, couldn't avoid that shot against the Patriots. But thanks very much. Next up, General Holmes.
Thanks, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm pleased to be here as well. This is an impressive panel. Great talk so far. I'm here with a room full of experts, actually a convention hall full of experts on the military side and on the industrial side about how to do this. I'll try to aim my comments at relevance to air and space forces, but I think as Admiral Richardson did, they're universal. And the longer you have to wait to talk, the less you have to say, unique to say. So I'll try not to beat dead horses too hard. Typically in the Air Force, you know, we focused on training pilots. And a lot of our training iterations have been about pilots. Some of my metaphors will be there, but it's really about the larger force, not just flying ops, but all the operators, including cyber operators, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance forces, command and control forces, which is a unique problem for the Air Force because all of our command and control is engaged every day around the world for combatant commanders in a theater air operations center, and then logistics under attack, as Jenny laid out. So if we're going to have a new American way of training, I'll say that I think we need more of four things to make it a new way. It needs to be more relevant. It needs to be more secure. It needs to be more affordable. And it needs to be more ubiquitous. And for my fellow East Tennesseans in the room, that means it needs to be everywhere as we work through it. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is get the maximum return from each training iteration or each training event through live, virtual, or constructive training and combinations of those. So first, relevance. If you grew up in the Air Force, you probably spent a third to a half of your time pretending to be the other guys because there were not enough resources to go around. So about half of your flying, you were doing red so that guys could train blue. And relevant training needs to focus on blue, and we have to find ways to allow our crews to spend more time being blue and less time being red. And again, live, virtual, constructive training offer great ways to do that. When I talked about those other groups that have to be successful alongside, the environment is important. It needs to include both, a full-up joint all-domain command and control environment and the tendency that will have for commanders to use 1,000-mile screwdrivers to directly tell people what to do, but you also have to learn to go in the environment without or with degradation dominance, as Jenny said, to be able to work on your own and make your own decisions. You need to practice individual skills, but also teams, as Admiral Richardson said. And so if your mission requires suppression of enemy air defenses, if it requires tactical air control party, if it requires airborne early warning, you need to have those capabilities there. And often you need to train with those capabilities as the training audience and not as training aids. How many have been to an exercise where your job was just to be a training aid for someone else to have a training audience and you didn't get much out of it? It also has to include, as Admiral Richardson said, if we're going to fight with AI tools, then we have to rehearse with those AI tools and learn where people should make decisions and where AI can be trusted. It should include the relevant SAPs or special access programs. If you're depending on a cyber capability to turn out the lights somewhere, you'd like to be able to exercise that and make sure that they know how to do it. It needs to be joined and combined, so it needs to be in the right environment. You need to have the right relevant threats, air threats, ground threats, electromagnetic spectrum threats, cyber threats, space threats, and you'd like to do both your own advanced capabilities and the threat's advanced capabilities. In a simulated environment, it needs to be in a physics-based environment where you're not white carding the events, but you know whether they actually worked or not. Instead of typically what we do is say, here's a space effect, degrade your performance by 10%. So you need to get past that. And then it also needs to be individualized. And I think we talked about artificial intelligence for warfighting, but there's an increasingly important role for artificial intelligence in training. In the Air Force's Pilot Training Next efforts, as they were looking at ways to train pilots better and faster, they captured reams and reams of information and data on the students that were training, and they found that they could individualize the lessons for the students. And so that's part of a move from what I would call activity-based training, where you measure training in how many flights you flew or how many events you accomplished or how many times you flew this year, to performance-based training. And with an artificial intelligence tool, you're able to say, Captain Holmes has these 7 areas down, but he's not very good at these 3, and so we're going to focus his next training on those 3 areas. And that will help us report readiness in a much better way to our masters at the Department of Defense and on the Joint Staff. So from activity to performance. So that's relevant. It needs to be secure. And again, Admiral Richardson talked on this, but if you go train in an outdoor range, you usually see a set of slides that show the overhead coverage from adversary space assets. And there aren't many windows left to train in or to test in or to do things during the daytime or the nighttime when somebody's not watching. So it has to be secure from overhead threats, from air collection, from surface collection, from cyber collection in the live virtual constructive environment. And that will take a whole of government effort. The People's Republic of China works very hard to be in the stands every day during the week to get ready for the game on Sunday, which includes commercial interests all around the world, attempts to buy properties under training ranges so they can put sensors, Gulf oil wells. It'll take a whole of government effort to secure our live ranges and the virtual and constructive ranges. So 2 is secure. 3 is ubiquitous or being everywhere. And that's where, again, I think a live virtual constructive mix is really important. Our crews need to be able to train at home station, and we can't afford to have all of those resources there. Again, as Admiral Richardson said, you can't bring all the ships from the fleet and all the capabilities together every day. You can't do the same thing on the air or the ground. So how will you simulate that? So you have to be able to do it at home station, but you also need to be able to do it at home. You need to be able to bring parts of that in through a cloud and be able to have access to the material and to be able to work on some little part of it on your iPad if that's the part that you need to practice, and you see examples of that out here on the floor as well. You need to be able to train when you're on deployed action. If you buy the idea that we purchased the F-35 in the Air Force to be able to defeat advanced enemy surface-to-air defenses, and if you deploy an F-35 squadron to the Gulf, every day they're deployed, they get less capable in that primary mission that we want them to have. Their readiness falls off every day that they're there. And so what can we do to give them the capabilities to take along with them, either in a suitcase or on a laptop, or they can keep training for that high-end mission while they're doing a simpler task. And you need to also be able to make it work in training detachments. So at home station and home, in combat or readiness deployments, but also when you deploy to the flags or to the large training exercises to be able to make that work, which means you have to decide what you can afford in large range complexes like Nellis and J-Park in Alaska, and what you have to have in your neighborhood backyard ranges. So that's being everywhere. And then the last one is affordable. The Air Force got into a spiral as cost per flying hour went up on systems that were older and older and harder to operate, that reduced flying time, but that increased money for flying hour costs also reduced the amount of threats that were available to train against, and had an impact on the training infrastructure that supports both live, virtual, and constructive training. You have to find ways to do that at probably a 95% solution and not spend the second half of the program on getting to that last 5%. You have to find creative ways not to duplicate capabilities. At one point we were discussing going down the road with a secure, multi-level access, coalition-friendly, software-defined radio system for combat, and then another one for training on our training complexes, and I don't think we can afford both. So you need to be able to train on the same networks that you'll use to fight. That blue-red mix will require, I think, a mix of live aggressors, whether they're in uniform or whether they're contract, unmanned targets, and the ability to train against unmanned systems, and then augmented reality as part of the live virtual constructive system. So those four things, I think you have to have more of each of those for a new way of training. You have to maximize the impact of each event. You want to move from an activity to a performance-based way of guiding and directing and measuring your readiness using AI tools so that you can be more relevant, more secure, more ubiquitous, and more affordable. Thanks.
Thank you so much, General. You were talking about the blue-red mix, and I was thinking, we've just been recently doing some work on the new, AUKUS, or whatever you want to call it, the Australia, UK, US alliance, and we were talking about high leverage things we could do beyond just sharing submarines and other things, and one of the things would be increased training. And to your point, live, virtual, and constructive is one way to bring not just the blue-red mix, but also to bring the green side into it as well, because I think it's something that we struggle with a lot. Okay, next up, I'd like to welcome General Paul E. Funk from U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command. General Funk.
Hey, thanks everybody, and what a distinguished panel. And I always seem to have to follow Mobile Holmes there. That's always a tough act to follow, but I'll try to do my best. And Jenny, thanks for setting the conditions, and Admiral, it's great to hear your thoughts on this too. It won't be surprising to anyone to note that I agree with what everybody said, and I think that part of the way we got to look at this in the future is we have to have a decisive action training environment that allows us the ability to train in an unclassed fashion with our allies and partners around the globe too. So I add that as first we got to start with how we're going to go to war, and we're going to go to war with allies and partners. So writing for release and training on platforms and systems, et cetera, that allow our allies and partners to participate fully is very important. I think that what you're hearing is we're learning from each other. We've done a much better job in terms of integration, our joint capabilities to test, and that's been largely done through our JADC2 efforts, where we've actually integrated all the various new capabilities that are gonna drive toward a multi-domain operations forefront here, and that really is how we've got to be able to train. I do think, and I would caution, that the most overlooked principle of war is simplicity. At U.S. Army Forces Command, Mike Garrett is actually focused on getting the foundations done right. So he calls this foundational training. And frankly, he's right. At the first echelon, we have to be as lethal, as capable, and as credible as always. And that means we've got to provide those capabilities, but we got to build the environments, the scenarios, all of the simulations and simulators that allow our fighting units on the ground or in the air the ability to interact together on their, somebody said this already, their warfighting systems. I think that you'll find the speed of technology change in the way the way things are being militarized. We never thought would be militarized. We always thought we'd have that easy way to, get on down to the port and then get on some ships and move over and then go over there and open a can of whoop bass. Well, that's not, that's probably not going to happen. The contested environments is a real consideration, and I think we're training with that. We've stopped. We actually have converted our training centers already to look at and make it a contested environment as you arrive. We used to go in and we'd build it down and then we'd build combat power, et cetera, et cetera. Now it's a contested environment the whole time. So we're seeing that. Mike, I think, talked about, you can't hide anymore. And while we have to be able to train and secure with some things, we also, in the information fight, somebody asked me to think about this from a national level in terms of the elements of national power. If you think about being able to show the capabilities and demonstrate the things we can do, and then actually use the information environment and really drive our decision-making processes at the highest level to show our capabilities intentionally, that's a different way than we usually do, for sure. We usually don't do things that way. As you see, there is an emergence and a re-emergence of great power competition. So we have built this decisive action training environment to be the best of breed. We'll take the best capabilities and weapon systems from our adversaries and apply them to our training environments so that we have to start that. We started a couple of years ago to deal with cyber activity at the training centers. What we're working on building a range out west that connects to NTC that's going to give us the ability to use our EW capabilities, and really we're trying to do that in a joint fashion so we can use the Buffalo range system out there that connects so that we can all use the capabilities and do those things and continue to test like we do out there right now. What I'm also encouraged about, and we'll leave for questions after that, I want to remind everybody why we train. As we are transitioning and modernizing the Army, we got to continually come back to the junior generation here and convince them that the reasons we train are to build confidence in our doctrine, in our tactics, in our equipment, in our leaders, and in ourselves. So building the confidence necessary by making sure they know, and I think Admiral Richardson said this, we got to fight contested, we got to fight without things, lacking of dominance, but we also got to be ready to overcome obstacles. We're the United States military. We got to do hard things. And we got to do them. It doesn't matter. We must prevail. Fight outnumbered and win has not gone away. That's not going to change. being second to the fight in many cases probably won't change because we want to be fighting the away game, and then pulling our allies and partners in to our systems so that they're not so exquisite that nobody else can use them is really a paramount to making sure we have success. I think that we talked about the after-action review. We've talked about that gave us the results necessary. We're learning every day from each other, and that's the unique part of this thing. I think you'll see in 10 years or less that in the big thought for us is a cross-functional team working on the synthetic training environment. And from there, I can see a day when you'll come into basic combat training or basic officer leader training, and you'll have an avatar, and your avatar will interact in the environment for you all the time. And it will use your characteristics. You'll have some sort of a wearable that will feed it, and that you will operate as efficiently or least efficiently based on your conditions, how well you do on your fitness test, how well you do cognitively, how much sleep you're getting, how your nutrition works, will interact in this system, and then you'll compete across the spectrum of conflict in these environments. You will enter and exit this environment using both an avatar, and then you can do live, virtual, and constructive doing that. Constructive allows us the ability to put scope and scale in. Of course, everybody knows live is the most exquisite, the most fun, the things that we all want to do, but it's also the most expensive. And then finally, the virtual world allows us to use simulation so that we get reps and sets, because that also is one of the things that doesn't go away, and that is the reps and sets necessary to build to reestablish our will upon anybody else that we might face. So based on all that, because that panel back there is much smarter than I am, I'm going to turn it back to you and be ready to go to questions. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, General. You brought up a couple things I think that interact really well with what Admiral Richardson and General Holmes have been talking about, which is that when we are going to be training in a live space, because of the observability of it, we may want to limit some of the things that we're doing so our adversaries can't see them, but it gives us a chance, I think, to do some interesting things with revealing for a deterrent effect and concealing for warfighting effect. So we might want to keep the really, the trick plays in the virtual and constructive space, and then keep maybe our deterrent effects in a live space to telegraph those, to say, look at the cool things like we can do, like we did with Assault Breaker back in the 1980s. So I think that's an interesting thread that we'll pick up in the Q&A.
Chris, I think you're seeing China do that right now.
Oh yes. That large aircraft carrier in the desert is not there by accident. Okay, with that, I'd like to turn it over to our last panelist, but certainly not least, DASD Kimberly Jackson.
Thanks so much. I'm glad that I'm having better luck than Jenny did, so let's hope it holds out. So thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here among so many experts, both on the panel and in the audience, and I promise that I'm not just saying that because y'all got me out of the Pentagon for the day, but I do appreciate that as well. So as many of you know, as it relates to training, the role of OSD is to set the policy, the oversight, and the guidance for the services to develop personnel capable of operating across any mission set that we ask them to. In that capacity, we recognize that many fundamental aspects of training actually are not going to change, meaning we still have to train the way that we fight or that we anticipate that we're going to have to fight. But as my fellow panelists have pointed out, and I certainly agree, there are many aspects of training that are going to have to evolve to meet those changing demands that we're placing on our forces. So, for example, and some of these have already been brought up, how we employ new technology, how we generate greater interoperability with our partners and with our allies, as General Funk pointed out, how a changing climate affects how and for what our forces train, and more broadly, how we prepare our leaders to think and operate flexibly to respond to what is asked of them in the future. These shifts that I'm talking about in our training practices tie directly to what I'd like to talk to you about today, which is strategic readiness. So why am I talking about strategic readiness? I have not forgotten that this is actually a panel about training, I promise. But as Chris pointed out, I'm the DASD for Force Readiness. So what that means is I oversee the Pentagon's policies that ensure the preparedness of the Joint Force. And that, of course, includes but is not limited to training. So while my portfolio does not include establishing the specific training guidance that the services must follow in establishing POIs, that's the jurisdiction of my sister DASD, Caroline Baxter, in Force Education and Training, my office ensures that we as a department are effectively incorporating training into our readiness assessments, predictive modeling efforts, and more broadly into our policies about how we must be balancing near-term readiness and longer-term force structure and modernization demands to meet our national strategic objectives. So you might have read or heard about some of these concepts that underpin strategic readiness, namely in War on the Rocks by the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, the Commandant of the Marine Corps earlier this year, who aptly said that we must redefine how we conceive of readiness and how we develop and prepare our leaders in an increasingly complex environment, or we risk falling behind our competitors. Today, leaders across the department now recognize that we must broaden the aperture of how we view readiness across time, so both near-term and long-term readiness and modernization, threat, and also dimension, so things like human capital management, sustainment, mobilization. Training is a fundamental element of this drive towards strategic readiness. Not only is training integral to how we achieve and measure operational readiness, but how we train today in advance of tomorrow's challenges, and how we reimagine who and with what and for what we must train in the future will be decisive in strategic competition or high-end conflict, whichever we're going to face. However, I don't need to remind this audience that resources are finite. We can't train for every possible eventuality. And we also don't define readiness as all forces being ready to accomplish all things at all points in time. So we must construct training and risk assessment frameworks that are both agile and deliberate to meet mission requirements and build and balance the readiness of our near-term challenges and also our joint force into the future. Directly related to my portfolio, we have to rethink how we measure and how we assess readiness overall, and specifically as it relates to training. We have to ensure that we're asking the right questions to understand if personnel are adequately trained to operate under future conditions, and that's going to require innovation, which is hard enough, as we all know, and in some cases, culture change, which I would argue is actually much harder. Further, we have to arm our senior leaders with as much objective information as possible to make rational, informed decisions to ensure readiness needs are built, maintained, and balanced across threats and time horizons. That's what I mean when I talk about strategic readiness. So to accomplish this, my office's primary focus is really embedding the concept of strategic readiness throughout our major decision-making processes within the department. We're undertaking this in a number of different ways, including first drafting a DoD-wide policy that not only defines strategic readiness, primary roles and responsibilities, core dimensions of strategic readiness, but it also provides for a strategic readiness assessment framework that will objectively identify gaps in priority areas for future department investments and focus. Of course, how we train, what tools and technology we use to train, and what future scenarios that we train for will play a key role in that assessment. Another major strategic readiness initiative my office is spearheading in partnership with the Marine Corps is the development of a predictive system dynamics-based modeling effort called the Readiness Decision Impact Model, or the RDIM. So the RDIM is designed to leverage the department's data transparency efforts that the Deputy Secretary has been pushing. And it's intended to illuminate the cascading effects, second, third, fourth order, and beyond effects of policy and resourcing and operational decisions on readiness now and into the future. So the RDIM will directly relate to training. So for example, as you all know, unit training is generally scheduled based solely on the unit's deployment cycle and its availability. But using the RDIM and working with the services, we're going to be able to better identify the right periods of time and specific conditions that make training more effective and use those insights to enhance the efficiency of our unit's training time. We can then understand how we use the time to train ratios that we're coming up with to think about things like deploy to dwell and understand how that is actually affected by and affects future deployments. In other words, the RDIM is going to allow us to focus not only on the impacts of decisions on training, but the impacts of training on the outcomes of our decisions. Moreover, these strategic readiness efforts are contingent on our leaders being trained and developed to make decisions supported by, and I think especially in the absence of, this type of information. So to that end, I have to carry the water for my sister Dazzy ship and talk about the 10-year effort that the Force Education and Training Office is currently running to develop the training capabilities for a peer adversary fight called the JOTI, the Joint Operational Training Infrastructure. Some of you may have heard of it. The JOTI describes the ends, ways, and means to achieve the department's joint training goals. So it comprises material elements such as training systems, networks and ranges, and non-material elements such as policies and processes that guide how training resources are developed and used. The JOTI's initial focus areas, such as joint interoperability training and training in a contested space environment, are structured to achieve significant advancements in training and exercise capability and infrastructure that support integration across warfighting domains. So finally, and this is my favorite topic that my team knows that I always have to inject anytime that I'm speaking publicly, I would be remiss if I didn't end on what I do feel is the most salient point. We cannot be strategically ready now or in the future without focusing on the recruitment, training, development, and retention of talented leaders. In the future, we might have all of the technological advantages, access to every data point, the most articulate strategies, the most articulate campaign plans, and we will still not be ready if we don't have the right leaders, both military and civilian, to lead organizations from the platoon level to the entire Department of Defense to effectively and responsibly use, iterate, and advance those efforts. These leaders must be diverse in both perspective and in background, but commonly trained in how to think critically rather than in what to think. To that point, we must evaluate the potential of future leaders beyond past performance and operational success to take into account the myriad of factors that contribute to successful leadership at the next level and ultimately to strategic readiness. Despite how challenging it can be to fight against bureaucratic inertia and deeply held paradigms, which I absolutely know that challenge, I believe that the department is making positive and truly fundamental strides towards approaching readiness from a strategic perspective. From rethinking how we train to how we use data to assess that training against strategic objectives, to institutionalizing these efforts throughout the department's decision-making processes, I believe we have the momentum and the collaboration on strategic readiness goals that is required to prevail in competition and in high-end conflict. I am excited to continue to advance these critical initiatives, look forward to your questions, and thanks so much for your time.
Okay, so I have some questions for the other panelists, just to exercise my authorities as the moderator, and then we're gonna open it up to the audience for some questions for you all. But I really wanna jump on what Dazzy Jackson just said, because it's one of the key questions that I have, right? So we've had some excellent representatives here from the armed services, but then we've also got this joint perspective, right? This joint operational training infrastructure. And my question really is, the services have very unique training requirements, whether it's for their environments or their systems or what have you. At the same time, there's a realization, and I think General Funk really talked about this a lot, that we need to be able to integrate our operations across domains, across these service and component boundaries, to include up to and including allies and partners. And I think what that hits at is a tension between developing these joint, combined, whatever you want to call it. I'm sure there's going to be an acronym with like 70 different words in it. But developing those kinds of systems that everybody can plug into and play with versus developing the service-specific things that allow General Holmes to do fighter pilot things, which isn't the same thing that I might have needed when I was a ranger shooting guns out in the woods. It's totally different sets of systems. So the question I guess I have for you and for also the rest of the panelists to think about is how to make sure that we can develop those things so that we have enough joint, combined, multi-domain flavor while they're also still affordable, while we also have some of these service-specific things as well. And how do we balance the tension between those things moving forward?
Sure, so thanks so much. This, to me, sounds like a very simple answer, but it's rather shocking, or perhaps not, depending on your level of experience in the Pentagon, how actually not simple this is. The answer is buy-in, right? You need to build these systems, these frameworks from the ground up. Every single thing that my office is currently endeavoring to build, so up to and including the RDIM that I was talking about, we do not build that without working directly with all of the partners that policy that we're building, that framework, that model we're building is intended to affect. Having that ground level buy-in helps us not only ensure that the product that we're putting together actually accurately reflects the equities of those we are trying to push this out to who will utilize it. But the more buy-in that you can get, the more likely that initiative is to succeed. And I think when we talk about the RDEM as a very specific example, that's a concept that my office is driving from OST, but we've developed it in partnership with the Marine Corps. It's very much intended to help the Marine Corps understand how they're going to get to their goal of Force Design 2030 and to understand what risks that they are incurring along the way. We are not going to try to take the Marine Corps' model and apply it then to the Air Force. We're trying to work with the Air Force as an example, work with the Army as an example to help understand and leverage all of their existing analytic efforts and plug that into the broader joint force model without trying to take away any of the goodness that they've developed on their own right. And I think that same model certainly defines the other non-modeling efforts that we have as well.
Anything on your end, or Jenny, do you have a question?
I mean, I can jump in, I guess, more from the technology side. So I think this is a problem we see within the training community. And actually, Kaylin Darham's in this room, and she's written a brilliant piece for the Army Mad Scientist that kind of gets at this. So right now, when it comes to modeling and simulation tools in use in training, most of them are integrated into one monolithic framework. So that framework or engine is responsible for the entirety of the simulated world, to include visualization, pathfinding, physics, AI. And this is problematic because it confines training designers to that engine or that framework simulation offering. And the thing is, basically, we need to be moving towards procuring systems and platforms that are developed with modularity up front. We need to be thinking about these things from like a platform approach that allows us to, bring in additional models, like Lego bricks, to be honest, so that these environments can evolve as the character of warfare changes, that these environments can evolve and make it very simple for us to play nicely with other services. And I think while we have been talking a lot more about modularity, you see that in RFIs and RFPs, oftentimes we pay lip service to modularity without actually procuring systems that are broken down into modular components or microservices. And I think the more that we lean into that as a community, the more we'll be able to ensure that the systems that we procure today won't be legacy systems tomorrow when they're actually fielded.
Awesome, thank you. All right, I have another question, and this question can go in one of two directions for everybody on the panel. There's been a host of new initiatives over the last 5 or 6 years involving wargaming, experiential learning, and training, along with what I think is the explosion represented by what you see out on the display floor in new technologies in this space. And my question for the panelists is, what in that area has you most excited? Or if there's something that doesn't have you excited, what is it that has you most concerned? And I'll start with General Holmes.
I was thinking while the previous conversation was going on that on this continuum of training from individual skills up to larger and larger formations coming together, the larger the formation your training gets, the harder it is for anybody to get anything out of it. It becomes just putting on the large formation exercise is what you achieve, and everybody's training goals are subjugated to that goal. So I think what I'm most excited about are the capabilities of using the virtual and constructive capabilities to be able to bring all the elements to a training iteration, but still being able to focus on one unit's training objectives. Right now, if we come together to, go to the NTC, there's a ground commander whose area has objectives that he has or she has to focus on. They're getting a report card on what they're getting, and they really don't care about the air component's objectives, and they can't because of the way the system's built, and you could go the other way around. So I'm excited about the opportunity to model that part. And the second thing I'm excited about is the ability to use AI tools to sort through the balance of the knobs that John talked about. Mm-hmm. So right now we do that kind of in our service aids. We talk and we have our own ideas and we settle how much to put into the different knobs to try to get to the right place to get the most effective ready force that we can present to the department. I think there's an opportunity to use those tools to sort through what will drive the readiness needle the most with the next $1 million or the next $100 million in the program.
Great. Okay. I saw you mentioned the 3 magic letters that perk up the TRADOC, NTC. So General Funk.
So I I'm excited about anything that is immersive, repeatable, and analytical, and scalable, just as General Holmes talked about. Because having the ability to scale it to fit any training environment. See, I think I want to get out of the brick and mortar business. I want to get out of borders and things like that, and I want to take the training to the soldiers, not the soldiers to the training. And as it relates to the joint force, I think that anything we're doing has to have integrated training objectives. And frankly, as we work to bring more capability in the Joint J7 and being able to use the Joint National Training capability as well, I think that anytime we get those opportunities, we should take them. I know we don't fight as individual services. I know we do man, train, and equip by that, but we don't fight that way. And so, having been a CJTF and a CPLIC commander, that's for sure. And so I think anything we can do that allows us the ability to scale, repeat, back up, try it again, and learn something on it on those 4 systems I talked about: ourselves, our soldiers, our leaders, and our doctrine. I think it's worth the effort to get after. Over.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah, I'm actually pretty optimistic about our ability to operate jointly, and this spectrum of training. There's a real role, I think, for skill development at the service level, right? I mean, General Holmes needs to train combat pilots to be able to fly their aircraft better than any pilots in the world. General Funk, the challenge is the same for the Army and each of the service. So there is a role for that, and I think we just have to be careful that we don't, kind of elevate and get too joint too early before we really develop those really exquisite individual skills. So you ask what we're not excited about, and so. Being the nuke in the room, I'll be happy to talk about that. You walk around the floor, and you just see absolutely stunning technology, and that does get you excited. Live, virtual, constructive, all of those things, the ability to augment reality, the ability to reach out and bring training to each individual desktop, tablet, what have you. Very meaningful training. But what lies behind that is just a giant administrative, procedural mountain range to be able to bring this technology and put it anywhere near an actual warfighter. And if you can get through that mountain range, and that's a big if, particularly for some of the not huge companies that are bringing disruptive and decisive technology to bear, not only for trading, but for everything else. If you can get through that mountain range, it takes years, right? So in the training context, you'd like to have what's called a learning curve, right? Where you do scenario 1, you get some feedback, you learn some lessons, and then you go in and you do scenario 2, right? Which allows you to incorporate those lessons and get better. What happens, by virtue of this long time constant that it takes, the team that did scenario 1 is gone, right? So scenario 2, there's no relevance, there's no correlation between the 2 events, and we're just training everybody for the first time, right? And we've got to be able to do better than that. We've got to get on this time constant. We buy things really in 3 different time constants now. We buy platforms at sort of the decades-long time constant. We buy systems at kind of the Moore's Law time constant, 3 to 5 years. And we buy software, or we should, at like an overnight type of time constant. We're not there yet, but to really be relevant, we've got to get there.
Are you talking, John, about things like authority to operate, authority to connect? I mean, for all these systems on the process? Or?
Just as great examples of hurdles that everyone has to leap over, and so yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say I think the thing that I see that simultaneously excites me and concerns me, and you've seen it in every single person's comments, is data. And are we actually going to build shared data sets that everybody can use and leverage with common standards and common interface protocols, or are we going to do what we generally do, which is buy a bunch of things that don't talk to each other, hoard all our data so that nobody else can see it, not share it because we're worried about what it says about our readiness or our ability to execute or our particular program. And I think if we do build systems that can share, I think there's a possibility out there where we can integrate. So I come from the analytic world, right? So training is something I did 20 or 30 years ago. But to me, what's interesting is to be able to take results of war games, results of modeling and simulation, and then correlate that with results of training exercises. It's something that we just don't do well today in the Department of Defense because each one of those exists in a different organizational stovepipe with different data sets. We're not sharing those among them to create this sort of shared learning environment that goes really, really fast in a cycle. Instead, we have years-long cycles that sort of exist in parallel and occasionally talk to each other, but only at the level that you're talking about, General Holmes, which is at the 8 level, right? It doesn't happen down below. So that excites me if we can do it. It concerns me because our tendencies and our proclivities suggest to me that we won't do it, that we will actually maintain our stovepipes, and that, frankly, the mountain you're talking about won't just be a mountain, but it'll be a mountain covered in brambles and glaciers with bears on it, and that all the cool technology that we see out on the floor won't ever make it into the hands. So, there's sort of like
So I'd like to shoot a couple of those bears and take down a few of the brambles. So there are some actually really kind of inspiring initiatives going on within the DoD to get after some of the challenges that Chris was just highlighting when it comes to having this kind of holistic learning ecosystem where we're sharing that kind of data across the DoD. And I would like to point to Say Schatz in the front row. So she's the director of the Advanced Distributed Learning Initiative at the DoD. And if this is something that interests you, I really recommend that you reach out to Say, because she does have to climb a mountain, but she's got a bunch of smart people working for her, and I really do have faith that we can start to get after some of these challenges.
If I could actually just go off of what you said, Chris. So obviously the most exciting thing that's going to fix all the problems that you pointed out is the RDIM that I was talking about. And I say that because I have to proselytize. But I do...
Cue the theme music.
Thank you. Phil Collins, certainly. I do certainly believe in it, and I actually do think that bringing together those currently disparate data sets and actually making sense of them, that is what the ultimate intent is. We are a ways off on that. But so there's what I'm excited about. But what I am actually concerned about, and I would say this is the keeps me up at night. I very clearly, and I think all of us are huge proponents of the drive that we're currently in towards having more data transparency, more data sharing. There are so many reasons that we point to that can advantage us in a myriad of ways. But I think that we have not adequately thought through what some of the drawbacks are. I don't profess to know necessarily what they are, but I can talk about a few of the concerns I have that I think could stem from an inadvertent over-reliance on data. The first is, I am concerned that over time, in certain corners of our military, the over-reliance on data could lead to the atrophy of critical thinking, of strategic thinking, especially, as Jenny pointed out, when we know, the one thing that we know is we're going to be operating in an environment or in environments where we're going to have degraded communications, degraded information. I don't know how we square that knowledge with our reliance and increasing reliance on data. I think that ultimately it can make us less flexible. The more information you have, the 1,000-mile screwdriver, right? It can make us less flexible and less able to respond to changing conditions the more information that we have because of that over-reliance. So those two, I think, are very related. And then the last piece, and this is probably quite obvious, but the more data that we have, the more data that our adversaries have on us. And so how do we actually protect that information? How do we ensure that it's secure? I know that we've got a lot of great initiatives to try to ensure that that is the case, but as we've seen time and again, that's not foolproof. So I think we embrace this concept of more data. We all are quick to point out the benefits of it, but we owe it to ourselves as a department to really think through how we mitigate some of the potential negative repercussions as well.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, and I think one of the concerns I would have, exactly in line with what you're saying, is that it becomes an end unto itself rather than an input to decision making. And I think we start training to a number rather than to a qualitative judgment of like, can we actually execute our warfighting tasks? And I think that's a great thing. I have one last question before we turn it over to the audience for questions, and that is to Admiral Richardson, and that is, are we doing Stonehenge tonight?
Yeah.
No, another Spinal Tap joke, sorry. All right, so any questions from the audience? All right, and if you just want to, I think there's a microphone right there. If you want to get up and stand in front of the microphone so we can all hear you. Otherwise, just yell really loud because the microphones seem to be experiencing some degradation.
This is not really a question, it's going to be advice. Consider advice coming from an old Army systems engineer who proudly served our nation for over 39 years. Back in the mid-90s, I was responsible for the development of the National Capital Region Joint Air Defense Operations Center. Its mission was simple: protect the National Capital Region from aerial terrorist attacks or threats. As a systems engineer trained by the Army, they paid for my training. One of the biggest things that was taught to me was the concept of graceful degradation. You didn't want a system, defend the National Capital Region, like, oh, the fuse blew up, okay, too bad. You have to have backup systems when radars broke down, what you do. So I designed it to allow for all that, but I was very meticulous on the training of all the crews. So for all those contingency plans and what you do, they knew what to do. So to me, I hear all of you, and you're right. We need to train when the day was not sunny and it's raining. But I feel from a pragmatic perspective, you need to start talking to your development community, think of graceful degradation, and then that help drive to an extent, not totally, what you're training, and all this technology can help. So when it starts raining, your crews are good at knowing what to do. Thank you.
Thank you. And as a resident of the National Capital Region, I really hope that system works as designed and intended.
It does.
And I hope it works during the rain.
It does all the time, and the Air Force were very kind to actually make sure that we were IVNB, and they gave us 3 gold stars.
Awesome. All right. Sir.
Peter Schnorr with Wing Brace, and Chris, you said nothing about bears. We didn't know that was going to be part of
there's
the
going to
brief.
be bears.
Individually and incrementally, you've all highlighted the issues of technology and all sorts of the advancements that we've seen over the decades as we've been coming to the conference. And for those of us, clearly I'm not of that age, we remember a system called JSIMS, which didn't want for, yeah, people are laughing, didn't want for money, but it wanted for an organizational response within the services. And argue, and you know, with a COMAC and a CNO and a DASD and 2 fellows and a TRADOC, it ain't about the money, it ain't about the technology, it's about the organizations where you are having your biggest issues. DMO, CSTE, JSE, CBS, WARSIM, OneSAF. It's the organizational response. No COCOM or Engage MAGCOM commander is going to go, hey, don't worry about it, I'll wait for your capability. I'll take my P card and buy my Oculus Rift and buy my HoloLens to go give my capabilities to my deploying warfighters. How do you change the organization? Is it a JCS thing? Is it a no kidding? I mean, I'll pay homage to General Funk. I think the Army's a little bit further ahead than most of the services in terms of, hey, you got the stick. But how do we change the orgs? Do you know what I mean? I mean, that's kind of a hand grenade, and I'll leave now. Okay. I mean, how do you change the organizations? Do you put somebody, like you give a 4-star responsibility for all of the services and they become a service provider? Do you give them budgetary authority? I know that's a political hot, but just a question.
Anybody want to jump on this one?
Well, I think you're exactly right. It's I talked about it a little bit in terms of the culture change being the hardest part, really, in any of these initiatives. And in my RAND capacity, actually thinking through the bureaucratic battlefield was something I spent a lot of my time doing. I would say that from a more, let's call it a tactical perspective, very simply, getting the 3s and the 8s to work together in the services would be such an organizational benefit to so many of the initiatives that my office oversees and that we work on peripherally. I think that is not, I'm not trying to suggest that is the only issue. OSD itself has many things that we could change in our own organization. But I do think that just from a practical perspective, we are often very surprised at how little overlap there is in the service 3s and 8s and also in the Joint Staff 3 and 8. We, as the Force Readiness Office in OSD, actually don't have a single readiness counterpart in any of the services or in the Joint Staff. That we can work that to our advantage, of course, and we have more partners to help us carry the water in certain initiatives, but oftentimes we get caught in well, you coordinated with the 8, but you didn't coordinate with us, so we're not on board. And I think that ends up, it sounds perhaps small, but that ends up setting us back in so many initiatives for so long in ways that I think that all of us can agree we could do better to move past. As a former 8?
Yeah, I was going to say.
Well, I had a conversation out on the floor today with somebody, and we agreed that the only organization that really matters in the budgeting process are the appropriations committees on the Hill. Everybody else plays at resource allocation, but they decide, and so any meaningful reform on that process is going to have to involve them, and it has to be something that they're willing to do. I think on the Air Force side, I would tell you part of the problem is that unique among the services, the Air Force is organized in functional MASHCOMs, and those functional MASHCOMs have to balance buying new, readiness, maintaining the old, and their budget submission has to balance all those instead of, I'm an admirer of the Army and the Navy that have a Fleet Forces Command or a ForceCom that can advocate for readiness when they go in and sit in the meetings without having to worry as much perhaps about advocating for the other parts of it. And I may be misreading that. That may not be as true because I wish it was that way where I came from, but I think that we could do that, and then if you had those readiness commands, you could put them together and let them figure it out, and then you'd have to go to the appropriators and skip a whole bunch of people and try to get it done within all the constraints that they have.
Yeah, let me pick up on that last comment, General Holmes, is skip a lot of people. I think that one thing that I think would be worthwhile taking a stab at, it just seems that there are too many people involved. Authority is distributed amongst too many people, too many layers, and they're all empowered to say no. Mm-hmm. And it only takes one person to say no, and the whole thing is to give this talk about the number 10,000, right? So 10,000 is a kind of a popular number. 10,000 hours to become an expert. If you read Malcolm Gladwell, if you go to a hangar, an experimental place, you'll read about the 10,000 failed light bulbs that Thomas Edison used to learn how to make, or how not to make a light bulb. Our life is 10,000 PowerPoint briefs to try and gather the consensus required to do anything significant. I think that that's a cultural thing that we really need to take a look at. Thanks.
Yeah, I think my answer would be creating more bureaucracy is probably not what we want to do, but anyway, one really quick question. I've been told I have to wrap up promptly at 3:30.
Hi, Mike Cummings, UWS PEO. It relates to this. Funding follows structure, and that structure follows rewards for that given, silo to produce the results for that area of knowledge, skills, abilities we need to teach the sailors. There's no incentive built in. People do things for, to be rewarded, and our rewards aren't aligned with interoperability, right? So if you want to have interoperability, maybe a suggestion is you have a separate funding line that is about interoperability, working cross-functionally with other departments, similar to RTD&E, it's like a branch of that or something, because otherwise people are going to work in their structure that they have and achieve the results they have and be rewarded for those results.
Yeah.
Just a thought.
I mean, I have a belief that the Goldwater-Nichols reforms of the 1980s kind of spread a thin layer of joint frosting on top of what is fundamentally a service cake in the Department of Defense, and we're not fully integrated yet. But anybody have any thoughts on how we can set up incentives to increase more joint and multi-domain cross-training? Or I'm sure everybody's got a ton of ideas.
I'm just picturing myself sitting in the meeting with all the service aides trying to argue our particular program should get some of that money from the joint interoperability
Right.
fund to go do the things we really want to do. Yeah.
I feel like this is sort of the equivalent of a mic drop because we're ending, right? But promotion board instructions.
Okay. I think that's usually a good way to establish some incentives for people.
Yep.
Anyone else? All right. Well, I am going to take my prerogative as the moderator to say thank you to all of our fantastic panelists. I really do appreciate the time. It's very difficult to get this many 4-stars and DASDs and folks at a table. So I am super, super thankful. I'm super thankful for the quality of the comments and the questions from the audience. I'm thankful to ITSEC for having us here today. I want to close with one last thought. When I was a very young Ranger many, many years ago, then Colonel Stan McChrystal, who had just taken over command of the 75th Ranger Regiment, sent out a training memo that I will always remember. It said, "Good training must suck." And that was the first line, and it was bolded, and then period, and then there was a whole bunch of stuff that came after that. That's always stuck with me. Clearly, is now like 25 years later. And I have to say, this panel did not suck. This panel was great. I had a fantastic time today, so thank you to all of you. And that's it for us. Thank you.
Thank you.